Okay, welcome everybody to this conversation. I am super excited to have everybody here today. We've been planning this for a little while. We've got some really great speakers lined up for you. Today we're going to be talking about nonviolence and deliberative democracy. Who are we? Well, the RSA, the Royal Society for the Arts, has been around for a long time, 250 years. They're an organization that was founded in 1754 to embolden enterprise, enlarge science, refine art, and improve our manufacturers and extend our commerce. And there's been some pretty notable fellows. And right now there's about 30,000 fellows worldwide, each engaged in some sort of form of social entrepreneurialism. And a key focus of the RSA these days is thinking about systems thinking and how we can work together better across the globe in complex problems. So who is Deliberation Gateway? We're a thematic network of the RSA. We advocate for deliberative democracy. And this is the second in a series of conversations that we're hosting. We had one on AI a few months ago that was really cool. And all of these conversations are recorded and placed online on our website. And the next one is going to be about stewardship of fiduciary funds. So who gets to decide where all our pensions go? But today we're going to be focusing on non-violence and deliberative democracy. But first, I just wanted to mention some key partners of ours, Braver Angels. They're creating a national campaign for civic renewal, and we're really great fans of Braver Angels, and there's a huge overlap. And we'll see in a minute that basically deliberative democracy is about quality of conversation, and Braver Angels are all about improving the quality of dialogue in American politics. So a wonderful partnership is emerging here. So what is deliberative democracy? The core concept is very simple. It comes from this idea that authentic deliberation is the primary source of legitimacy. And this has been a field of research for 30 or 40 years. And so that leads to the question, what are the conditions under which authentic deliberation can occur? And I'm sure when we look at our debates on the TV between our presidents or candidates, we're not really thinking that this is high quality deliberation. So, we're thinking, how can we create much better dialogue and conversations between broad sectors of society? And that's the only way that we're going to be able to tackle the really serious and difficult problems that we have. And key to it all is listening and understanding different points of view with a view to learning rather than winning. Okay, so that's deliberative democracy. With that, I think I would like to start introducing our speakers. I'm going to stop sharing. And give me 1 second. Our first speaker today is going to be Lester Kurtz. And he is Professor of Public Sociology at George Mason University. And he's the editor of the Encyclopedia of Violence, Peace and Conflict. And I'm going to let him introduce himself and the work that he's doing. And he's going to give us a bit of a grounding in the school of thought, which is non-violence. Lester, over to you.
Hi. Yeah, I'm going to share my screen. Whoops. I'll see. I knew I should have gotten it all set up before we started. I have my notes instead of my slides. Yes, I'm a sociologist. I've been studying violence and nonviolence for quite a long time. And so I wanted to just, they've given us a full 5 to 7 minutes to explain everything we know. And so I'll try to do that quickly. If we want to come back to any of this, that would be fine. So one of the questions was, what's violence? Because in order to discuss nonviolence, of course, we only have the negative of violence as the term for nonviolence, unfortunately. But I like to turn to Johann Galtung. I thought he had a really momentous breakthrough. In 1990, he published an article that talked about different forms of violence, that there's direct structural and cultural violence. That direct violence is what we usually think of, physical violence, war, assaults, and so on. But there's also structural violence that harms people just as much as direct violence. Child malnutrition is my favorite example. Millions of children die every year of malnutrition. They're harmed just as much as if someone went around with a gun and shot them. Cultural violence is a set of cultural themes like racial and ethnic stereotypes, racism, ethnocentrism, gender stereotypes, sexism, that then legitimate both structural and direct violence. So the three of these are all interrelated. In fact, I've moved from his triangle to a web. I've also added eco-violence or ecological violence, which has become more significant, harm to the environment, more significant in the ensuing years since his 1990 article. Then what I like to do is to flip it upside down and take the same kind of general framework, but think about it in terms of nonviolence. And so we have direct nonviolence, which is the visible kind of nonviolence. It's social movements, protest, persuasion, non-cooperation, like boycotts and strikes, nonviolent intervention like sit-ins. But there's also structural nonviolence. When we create systems that actually don't harm people, systems that are just, that have equality of opportunity. We have community. We have peace systems which exist around the world. Bhutan's idea of gross national happiness as the paradigm for the economy. Cultural nonviolence, the themes like peace culture, love, justice, equality, well-being, I think empathy we should add. And then sustainability and deep ecology and so on for efficient use of resources. One final thing, I'm sure I'm in my 5 minutes, is that, I'm sorry if I'm going over, I'll be real brief. A number of years ago, I was with some Tibetan monks. I said, I didn't get my picture taken when I interviewed the Dalai Lama in Dharamsala. And I said, no, what's important is not that you didn't get your picture taken, but your karma is now intertwined with the Dalai Lamas. I thought, this is really good. Thank you. It really helps my karma. And the more I thought about it, the more I thought about how we do live in the web of these karmic relationships, right? Every thought, word, and deed has consequences. It ripples out. And it's much like network theory in the social sciences. So every act of harm causes harm, but then the people we harm are more likely to harm. Every act of compassion causes compassion. And so I think I see deliberative democracy as a kind of positive karma. So that's it. That's all I know. The rest is commentary, right?
Brilliant. Thank you, Lester. That's a fantastic introduction. So we've got these kind of core concepts that quality of deliberation is a source of legitimacy, but also we've got this whole concept of networks of harm rippling out, and that's what leads to violence. So already beginning to see these two major themes. So our next speaker is Roger. He's the founder and academic director of the Hannah Arendt Center for Politics and Humanities, and he's also professor of politics, philosophy, and human rights at Bard College. And he's written a whole host of books. I won't read them all, but the first one, The Gift of Science, Leibniz and the Modern Legal Tradition. So plenty of examples of work there. Roger, thank you for joining us today. And I'll just let you introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about what you're doing and what you're up to.
Great, Chris. Thanks. And I'll follow Lester in a way. Lester interestingly said that, in defining violence, you don't really have an opposite except for nonviolence. My work has over time been around the idea of power. And I think of power as the opposite of violence. Now, that's not the way it's always thought of. Many people have thought that violence is simply a form of power. So someone like Max Weber would say that the state is the rule of man over men through the allegedly legitimate means of violence. And he sort of equates violence with power, as do many other people. But I, following someone like Hannah Arendt, whose center I run, really want to distinguish power from violence. Whereas violence is a kind of means to some end that uses and seeks to. It's basically a means that can be justified or unjustified. Power is something that comes about through people acting together in the world. So when a group of people, whether it's a bowling league or a chess club or a town hall meeting or a Congress gets together and talks or deliberates and seeks to do something, they wield power, not violence. Violence is a technological means that can be justified or not. Today, we have a tendency to glorify violence, and I think we largely glorify violence today because we live at a time in which power is so diminished. I would say that the great crisis today in our world of politics, sometimes some people might call it the crisis of democracy, is a crisis of widespread disempowerment. People don't believe they have the power to meaningfully impact and improve the world they live in. They look at things like nuclear weapons, and nuclear Armageddon, or the climate change, or transhumanism, or the pandemics, and they think, what can we do? How can we stop it? And they also look at the fact that for the most part, they live in large countries with big bureaucracies, people they've never heard of, people they didn't elect, who are basically running their lives, and they think, I have no control. Bureaucracy is bureaucracy. We don't even think of it this way, but bureaucracy is the most violent form of government, because in a bureaucracy, there's no power. You don't know who's governing you. It's faceless bureaus, offices, and so we live in this world of radical disempowerment. I came to the issue of deliberative democracy through the idea of citizen assemblies, because of my real feeling of confronting the widespread powerlessness of our time, whether it's on the right, people who feel they've been completely disempowered, or on the left, people who feel they've been completely disempowered. I think that you can pretty much see that almost all sides of the American political debate and the polarization that we're so fond of talking about has its origin in a feeling of really radical loss of control and power over people's worlds. I've been interested in the idea that through a citizen assembly, through random selection, bringing people together to talk and deliberate together in a way that needs to, in a sense, reach some sort of a consensus, elevates people to not seek what they personally want, but to seek and to begin to understand what they share together with people in that room with them, a common interest, what holds them together. Very much like a jury takes, 12 randomly selected people and says, we want you to judge not according to your own morals, but to an idea of what the law says according to justice. A citizen assembly, deliberative democracy, says we want you to deliberate and come to some common sense, common idea, what's good for the common interest and not your own personal interest. And so I've turned to deliberative democracy in a sense to combat the powerlessness of bureaucracy and the powerlessness of a world in which people seem completely abandoned to their power and to their ability to control things. So that's how I've gotten into this issue and where I come from. So thanks very much.
Thanks, Roger. That's really, really interesting. You just gave me like all kinds of thoughts there. Like not least among them was the idea that violence is like applying energy to solve a problem. You literally apply weapons, which is just energy onto matter. But that power is about information going into people's minds, talking. It's about comparting information in a network and then sort of upgrading the neural pathways of people's minds, with ideas and thoughts, rather than just blasting them with energy and disrupting them, keeping their minds and bodies intact while you exchange information. I could see that completely, and that brings straight away that network kind of image that Lester created at the beginning. And so it's obvious from there that the interactions between people are in some sense the absolute key to this whole thing, and that sense of disempowerment that people feel can be directly affected by that. And I'm sure that April, who's our next speaker, has got some thoughts on this. April is a department chair and professor of applied communication at the University of Arkansas in Little Rock. And she's skilled in interpersonal communication, instructional design, group facilitation, and relationship-based change management. And she researches issues such as innovation and change, and very appropriately for this conversation, the use of communication to manage difficult dialogues. And as well as that, she's also a really one of the leading volunteers in Braver Angels, and she has an important role to play in that organization. And I'm sure she'll tell us a little bit more about Braver Angels. So, April, can I invite you to tell us a little bit more about yourself?
Yeah, absolutely. Be happy to do that. And I'll share a couple of slides here in a little bit.
Okay.
But let me just, up until 3 years ago, I would have said I am not interested in all talking about politics. I, as a communication professor, was teaching interpersonal relationship classes, research methods, and really didn't see the connection between political communication and interpersonal relationships until I came across the organization that Chris was talking about, which is Braver Angels, and jumped in kind of just looking to see what they were going to do. Originally, I was going to research the organization, thought it would be kind of a cool research project. And then I decided as I got into the organization and met people, you know what, I could actually have conversations with people who are different than me, that are outside of my normal kind of silo of people of my tribe. And I think it's important as we think about these kinds of topics to also be intellectually honest about where we're coming from in terms of our own academic perspective and our own experience. And so none of us come with just, and this would be true. So I'm illustrating this by the kind of thing that we do in Braver Angels by recognizing that it is not just about talking about politics. It's recognizing the person as a whole person, a person that's more than just a label. So because of that, I will introduce myself as a communication scholar, someone with a strong Christian faith background that values the dignity of all human beings, someone that comes from an ancestry that includes much violence against my people as a citizen of the Cherokee Nation. I mentioned those parts of my identity because they're only the tip of the iceberg to who I am. But I think it's important to realize that the people that we meet are much more, again, than the top label that we give them. So I realized that I needed to take action. My relationships were falling apart. I saw on Facebook that people that were in my local congregation were actually saying things on Facebook and other social media things that were mean to each other. And I'm like, why would you do this if you know that person is sit across the aisle from them? And I recognized the need to start taking the things that I was teaching in my classes into a place that could actually make relationships better. Found the organization, which was called at the time Better Angels, that's now Braver Angels, and really began to also start looking into some research on a couple of concepts. One concept is called conversational receptiveness, and the other one is called conflict resilience. Now I'm going to go into those and just talk about those briefly, and then I'm going to share what the Braver Angels way is, and then we'll get into what Chris wants to in terms of kind of a discussion. So one of the things that I think about, people criticize sometimes Braver Angels, and you'll see this in the way, the Braver Angels way that I'm going to talk about in a minute, is, well, what if I really have strong beliefs? Am I having to give up my beliefs? And I'm going to frame their work within this concept called strong civility. This is actually a concept that came that I got from an idea from a book called Beyond Civility, and written by a rhetorician and a communication scholar. And what they basically were saying is that strong civility is when I'm willing to lean into my differences with another person and be able to speak truth and love if I want to be able to do that, but also be able to be curious about what the other person is saying and be willing to also change my perceptions of them, perhaps even my perceptions of the perspective that they're taking. Well, in order to do that, it requires a concept called conversational receptiveness. I can define this as a willingness to engage with the other. Sometimes I compare it to having open hands, having an open heart. But it really involves perspective taking, imagining myself in the shoes of the other, realizing that there is another truth besides just my truth. In fact, there may be multiple truths, but can I come to it through a lens of curiosity, looking at it and wondering, I wonder, what would it be like? How did that person get to that point? What is their life story that actually led them to that point? Having that conversational receptiveness is key to being able to have strong civility in which I can advocate for my beliefs, but also approach the other with curiosity. Another concept is conflict resilience, and this is defined by Bourdon in a 2018 article as the ability to sit with and be fully present around those with whom we have fundamentally different views on critical issues. I'm going to read that again because I think it's so powerful. The ability to sit with and be fully present around those with whom we have fundamentally different views on critical issues. And I love the fact that it's used resilience in the term, because resilience is a muscle. It is something that we have to practice over time in order to be able to maintain civility and curiosity, not go into the neurological parts of our brain that are, some people would call the lizard brain or the amygdala, and immediately react out of fear or fight or fleeing kind of syndrome. We have to engage other parts of our brain that relate to curiosity. And when we don't find that we are able to sit with, then oftentimes we are demonizing and othering the other people. And it's that demonizing and the othering that actually cause violence, that escalate and cause the problems down the road. You know, the work that's been done to study the Holocaust, they did not see the Jewish people as human. They couldn't, or they couldn't have done the things that they did with them. So sitting with conflict, though, is not just taming conflict. It's not just pretending it's not there. It's discussing it openly. It's acknowledging the tensions. It's challenging, you know, and the challenges that it can create, but it's refusing to let the different views become this corrosive force that blinds us to the reality of common humanity. So when I think about that in the work that Braver Angels does, they have something that they call the Braver Angels Way. They actually normally start all of these with we. I took it off just to try to make the slide not quite as word heavy, but it's still very word heavy. I want you to focus, you could take a picture of this if you wanted to, but I want you to focus on the top three of these and think about how they might relate to nonviolence. When we can state our views freely and fully without fear. When we treat people who disagree with us with honesty, dignity, and respect. And when we welcome opportunities to engage those with whom we disagree. If we just took those three and we used those as a starting place, we could actually come to strong civility, the kind of civility that includes deliberations, deep listening, dialogue, confrontation, protest, and even civil disobedience, I think we could argue. Because they're behaviors and norms that we can use to engage differences in a way that still deepens the value, a sense of community and the value of other human beings, and over time can help communities move towards nonviolent systemic change. So there you go.
That's wonderful. Yeah, it's so interesting. And I'm wondering, in Braver Angels, April, have you ever had a moment where, just in your own personal experience, where you've seen people who were, previously not engaged with each other, like have a kind of meeting of minds? Anything? I'm putting you on the spot a little bit, but has that ever happened in your experience?
It absolutely has, and I've seen it happen in workshops that we do, in which we have people that are coming at. I did a common ground workshop on the abortion issue, and when I think about this, and I was thinking about this as one of our speakers was talking also about the citizen assemblies, and kind of thinking about the commonalities between what we do in some of our workshops with what they do in citizen assemblies. But what it requires is that you come to grips with the stereotypes that you're holding of another person, and that you actually say, you know what, they're also holding stereotypes of me. In order to be able, can I put those down, recognize there might be some truth in those, but can I put those down and actually also be able to be intellectually honest enough to acknowledge that my side is not perfect, And it's when I've seen that actual dialogue occur where they actually will talk about, you know what, my side, I really love it for these reasons, but I don't like it for these reasons. And you see the other person all of a sudden realize that they're not coming across as some dogmatic person that believes that they have to be changed or converted to their side, that you begin to say, oh, well, if you can do that, maybe I can do that too. And I have seen people do that on multiple occasions. And we also carry it into sometimes even committee meetings and things where we have disagreements when we're trying to make decisions that affect Braver Angels. So that maybe aren't political in nature. In fact, I'm getting ready to go into a meeting tomorrow in which we're trying to practice the things, wanting to listen to find out what the other person's thinking.
That's some of my favorite things in Brave Angels when we do that, when we meet other people and get to know them. And okay, my mind is awash with thoughts, as I'm sure all of yours is. So now what we're going to do, have a little chat about, just unpick some of these things. What I'd like to see is a sort of synthesis. And Daryl, if you could maybe put the four of us on the screen, then that would be great. And of all these different points of view. So, we've had this kind of web of violence, the different forms of violence and the antithesis of that. We've had this idea that power and violence are somehow separate. And at the same time, we've had this idea that listening to other people and relating to them kind of can create a sense of empowerment in sort of dynamics and change. So I want to just reflect some of this back to Lester, who's like our resident expert on nonviolence, right? Is that true? Like this idea of fear. If you're afraid, that you don't know what about the other. Is that the root cause of all violence? Just the fact that people are just afraid? Is it that simple?
No, but
Okay.
That's too simple an answer. But
yeah,
simplicity is always too simple. But fear is clearly an emotion that drives violence. Although I think greed, misunderstanding, lack of empathy, and so on are also, plus our socialization, right? We get socialized into the idea that somehow violence and this polarization that we're so enmeshed in at the moment. I was reminded when April was talking about a story of Thich Nhat Hanh, the great Buddhist monk who's an anti-war activist, who became increasingly spiritual, I think, over his lifetime, but he applied it to political issues. And someone asked him once, what would you say to Osama bin Laden if you saw him face to face? And he said, I would listen, which is such an extraordinary thing. And also empowering. I think I think in a way this story connects some of what Roger and April were both saying. And for me, the kind of Gandhian model is listen, analyze, mobilize. So you start with listening, which I think empowers people.
Right.
Can I add to something Lester
Please,
was saying, Chris?
If you have any thoughts, just jump in. Don't wait for me to ask. Yeah.
I mean, it strikes me that, fear or whatever can cause violence. Yes, maybe. But to me, the driver of violence that I understand is certainty and confidence. People who believe they know what's right are those who think they have the right to impose it on others. And so, the great glorification of violence comes from those who believe they know the answers, whether it's religious or ideological or whatever. If you look at the two great violent movements of the 20th century, right, Nazism and Bolshevism, they're both movements of ideological certainty, right? One thinks that one race is the chosen race, and one thinks one class is the chosen class. And so if that's right, or at least in any way right, which I think it is, but it's then exactly the kind of you know, listening to others and being able to expand your perspective and think from the perspective of others, in which you insist that others and other perspectives have something to say to you, and it's not just that you're going to convince them, but you're actually going to listen to them. Is the way to counter violence, or at least one important way to counter violence. And so I think that's what both the Braver Angel model and citizen assemblies aim to do, is to insist that we actually meet others in a common space and understand that we have things to learn from them just as they have things to learn from us.
Love it.
Chris, one of the things I was thinking
Yeah.
about is, as Roger and Lester were talking just now, is one of the things, and I hear this in Braver Angels too, where people will say, I want to have those conversations. I want to actually become curious, but I don't have anybody in my network or in my neck of the woods that I even know that's like that. Right.
Right.
And so we oftentimes will suggest we'll start getting to know, going to where whoever those people are might be. I think about what Daryl Davis did with the Ku Klux Klan. He'd hang out with him. He was a Black man hanging out with people who hate Black people, and so I'm like, what? I mean, that took courage, and they were not sure about him being there either, but he eventually became friends with them, and he'd go to their meetings. And so if a person is on the right and they're against the NRA, well, then there's probably some gun loving meetings, or NRA people that meet. Well, get to know them, go to their meetings, not to try to change them, but just to be curious, just to hang out, just to see if I can figure out who they might be. I mean, the other thing that I think about that Braver Angels, sometimes I've seen people do, is they'll actually do this exercise with a person once they do get to know somebody that's, from the other side, called Walk a Mile in My News, which is an interesting exercise. For a month, they actually take in the news feed that the other person takes in, and they have conversations during the month. And what they find is that, oh, no wonder we are so far apart. We are actually being fed different diets.
Yeah.
So, and that's another kind of way of being able to get to know people, cross the divide.
No, brilliant. Yeah, and that ties back to that comment I made about information, that this is about spreading information. And so there's so many different ways to go in this conversation. Like thinking about, there's a really cool quantum physicist, David Bohm, who says holisticism is not thinking about the whole as system. It's about thinking about the system from every possible point of view. And that certainty that you talked about, Roger, I've heard resistance from elected bodies, people who have a vested interest in being elected and so on. They resist this idea of deliberative democracy. How can a random person know everything that they need to know? I'm absolutely certain that they're complete idiots and they can't do all of the things that all the elected people can do. So there is this sense of certainty in certain classes of people that, fights against that. So I'm going to ask that question. Can random groups of people really come together and resolve conflicts? Is that even remotely feasible?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I think there's different models of justification for something like deliberative democracy. I'm not sure, but I believe it was Lester, no, maybe, or I forget who talked about authentic deliberation leads to legitimacy. One of you, either April or Lester, or was it you?
Yeah,
that's right.
That was my opening slide. Yeah,
right. Chris put up a slide or talked about how authentic deliberation leads to legitimacy. So this is one model of theoretical model for understanding the argument for authentic for deliberative democracy. I often call it the Habermasian model. I don't know if that fits with your background, Chris, but it suggests that if you get to what Habermas called an authentic speech situation, where there's a kind of equality and information flows and everything like that, and everyone comes in, you'll end up with a rational answer on the output. that's not my approach, but it's a very powerful one. My approach, and so the problem with that approach, of course, is what is an authentic decision speech situation where there's no power imbalances and all information flows clearly and everyone's going to rationally come up with an answer. It doesn't exist. I don't think it does, but there you go. The other model, is more a civic republican model, which is where I come out of, which is to say that we get together and we talk, and it's not clear we're going to end up with a rational speech situation or a authentic deliberation, because we don't know what that is, and we're not sure we're going to get the right answer or the best answer, but we're going to get an answer that we all come to agree with, and we come to at least accept, and that hopefully that answer or that conclusion will be one that finds what we share in common, right? There's too much focus on our differences today. What we need to understand is that every single one of us, even the most rabid Trump voter and the most rabid Black Lives Matter voter, can come together and find more they agree on than they disagree on. But we focus on the differences, not on what we agree on. And so in finding what we agree on, we find what is the common, what is our civitas, what holds us together, and we remake who we are as a people. And so the answer is yes, anyone can do that. You can be a farmer, a plumber, a lawyer, an investment banker, a politician, whatever, and you can come into a room with other people, and as we do in deliberative democracy or in Braver Angels groups, talk to each other and say, you know what, I like baseball, I like football, I like this, I like that, I like roads that go places, I like paved roads, I like schoolhouses that don't fall down. There's a lot we agree on, right? And so my view is that if you take the Habermasian authentic deliberation model, it's a harder sell, right? Mm-hmm. But if you take we're actually just trying to find common ground, it's actually a much easier sell. And I think you don't need to be educated or anything. You just need to be in a room and have maybe some facilitators who are going to help you. But in the end, you want to actually get rid of the facilitators too, because who are the facilitators? They may not be, they have their own biases and their own class biases and their own educated biases. They're just there to get you going. But at some point, these things should become self-perpetuating processes. And I think anybody can do it. And that's very much the American model of the yeoman farmer coming to a town hall meeting, and we get up and they're boring as all hell. But, after hours and hours, we decide, we want to hire one more teacher and one more policeman.
Right. Yeah.
Chris, it would be interesting to look at our founding fathers and see how many of them actually were well educated. I haven't done research on that.
I haven't,
but I would bet that they weren't all, and they were educated in life though, and so because the life experiences are so important, regardless of what they are. I agree with Roger. I mean, I don't think you invite everybody off the street to deliberate on every single issue, but you get people that have a stake in it. And so then they have a stake that's built in life experience. And if you can get them to share their life experiences with each other to see where the stake is, that they're coming from their perspective, all of a sudden you can generate compassion and possible solutions across, differences.
Yeah, interesting. And, the kind of equivalent basic question in sort of the non-violence sphere, deliberation. Yeah, if we can have people come together and make these questions, answer them, I get to learn about each other just as human beings. In what happens when the situation doesn't allow for that? Like, for example, what if someone's aggressive towards you? If someone's already into a violent situation, can you really use a non-violent reaction to that? Is there a sort of textbook answer for that, Lester? Or, I'm thinking about that. I mean, because I'm just thinking about what people are going to be thinking when they're listening to this conversation. Non-violence, just weakness,
Yeah.
Is that true?
Well, yeah, that is the classic question, and actually, we need to bring people in who faced violence to answer that question. Because part of the problem is people like me who do all this, who write about this stuff and do research and so on. We live in this sort of pleasant cocoon, where people are nice to us, and so it is really complicated. Actually, one of the best answers to that, I once heard a response to a question by Dave Grossman, who calls himself a killologist and does research for the U.S. Army Research Bureau. And he said, if someone's pointing a gun at you, the best thing to do is to look them in the eye. It's what you want to try to do, is to make yourself appear human, to make some kind of connection with that person. Now, see, I've not experimented with that strategy.
Yeah,
and I'm not anxious to.
no.
But,
I'm sorry. Have you finished?
go ahead.
I'm reminded of a conversation I had when I first got to Chicago, when I lived in Chicago, and I was curious about where is it safe, where is it not safe. There's a lot of gun violence in Chicago, and this guy told me where he could and couldn't go. But then I said, well, if I found myself there, and I went down there, would they like treat me with respect for being brave enough to go there, and like a sort of thing on from Star Trek, and they give me some respect? And he was like, no, they're just steal your money and shoot you. And I'm like, right, okay. And he said the one place, and this guy was a lawyer who did a lot of work in prisons and so on, and he said that if that guy looked at you and down a gun or whatever, and he knew that you knew you were about to die, then you would be in the same place that he was. Like he was like the Walking Dead in these gangs and so on in Chicago. Like they literally, their days are just numbered. And then he said he might let you go when you, and then so, but the core of that, which is kind of what you were talking about, is this kind of empathy. When this connection happens, when this link happens between people, when they see each other in this same place, then they come together and they form like a connection. I mean, I know that's just the thought.
Chris, I not that we can't, I mean, the way this is scheduled, you don't have it where we can talk to people that are actually in the chat, but there is a really powerful comment that Candace just put into the chat.
Great.
And she said she was raped at knife point by a man not of my race, and I was able to experience his hurt, shame, rage, and I connected with him, so he didn't kill me. And I made art of it in the future called Don't Judge a Heart by Its Color. And so there's an example. I mean, sometimes we want examples of how we can humanize the other. So yeah, hearts out to Candace and for what she's, what she did as a result.
Yeah. Thanks for sharing.
Yeah.
Thanks for sharing. That's really powerful. Yeah. And well, there you go. That's Roger's comment. That's really powerful. It's how do we build that power? How do we get that moment of connectivity? Now, those are extreme cases that we've just looked at when there was violence already on the table.
But I think a lot of times violence comes from the aggression comes from a sense of not ever being heard. I think about even with our children, right? So sometimes, a child can get angry and what is it that's causing the anger? Now there might be some psychological kinds of things, and it might be coming out of fear, certainly, but sometimes it's because they don't feel heard. So they're not in a space where anybody's listening to them. And that can happen with adults as well. So I do think that is another thing that sometimes can happen. They become aggressive. The aggressiveness overtakes, and yeah, they're not really listened to.
Yeah, I mean, and that's kind of what deliberative democracy is about. It's about getting people in the room. The kind of idea of a lottery, where you actually take a sample of people and you allow people who normally don't have a voice to come forward and make some decisions. Do you think we'll ever get to this point where general public will take the output of a deliberation and trust it? The people who weren't involved in that conversation, if this group says, we're going to do this, can other people really trust it if they weren't there to form that connection? And this speaks to how that output from a deliberation is communicated. And again, that then talks about media and the information that we get. So do we think that we could ever get to that point that a deliberation could set a law and people would go along with it?
I think so, yes. I mean, I think a lot of governments have legitimacy over history, right? I think for a long time, and at times, the United States government has had legitimacy. I think one of the reasons it doesn't today, or it increasingly doesn't today, there's a few. One is the amount of money that has gone into corrupting it. Two, maybe things like gerrymandering and other things that have gone into corrupting it. But I think the main one, and I think this plays a little bit on what April said earlier, is that, you know, up until 30 years ago, our Congress was made up of people much more representative of America than it is today. 100% of Congress has a college degree today. The 9 Supreme Court members all went to 2, I think, law schools, maybe 3.
The new one broke the mold. They're all Harvard and Yale.
They're all Harvard and
We got a
Yale,
woman from Notre Dame.
and so I think what you see for many people in this country is that the folks who are governing us are of a particular educated class, of a particular view on the world, and they find it so off-putting and offensive, and they feel that they've been completely cut out of their government. Not to mention the people who run all the bureaucratic agencies, which again are almost all college or even PhD or master's degrees people. That's not the majority of America. And so one of the things that I think matters is who's deliberating. And that's one of the reasons why civic assemblies, which use a lottery system to bring in a much wider range of voices, is important. I mean, I'll just add, I didn't say this earlier, but it's worth saying. The reason I got interested in this is that about 8 or 9 years ago, a student came into my office and said, I want to write my senior thesis on something called sortition. And I looked at him and said, absolutely not. And he said, why not? I said, because I've never heard of sortition. I don't know what the hell you're talking about. And he said, excuse me, but, and he said, well, you should learn about it. And I said, well, I'm the professor here, like certainty, right? Anyway, he gave me this book by David von Raybroek called Against Elections, and I read it at the time. And it changed, the next 10 years of my life. But the point is that democracies throughout history have never used elections to pick their representatives. Athens, the Italian democracies didn't use elections. They used lottery, sortition. This idea of picking your representatives by chance or by lottery. It was aristocracies that all the democratic theorists said that should use elections, because in an election you have what Bernard Manin calls the principle of distinction, which is that you vote for people who are respected, who are educated, and those are generally of a certain class. And so the lower class, the uneducated people, end up voting for educated people because they're the ones who have the credentials. And so it is, I think that there's so much skepticism and illegitimacy today because we've really created a class system. It's not an economic class system necessarily, but it's an educational and elitist class system. And if you bring in a wider range of people, I think there will be a much greater chance, and I think there will actually be more legitimacy to the outcome of deliberation.
That's a really good point. Lester, do you want to say something?
Yeah, can I pick up on that? Because I think, I was pondering Roger's initial comments about the lack of power. And I think that, in fact, oftentimes 2 competing ideas are both right, and so we one of the tensions is we have consensus, and in fact, I mean, the United Nations is doing a lot of experiments with bringing a lot of diverse voices, but they're all elites who are representing nation states. But there's both incredible power from a very small elite group of people, and then this disempowerment of the 99%, and so we have an increasing concentration of power and wealth globally so that even the global, these elites at the global level have incredible power over the rest of the world. There was a study done by a few years ago by a group of Swiss scholars doing networks of global social control, global corporate control, rather. They were looking at, corporations that buy corporations that buy corporations that buy corporations, which is the trend that we see worldwide. And they found 747 corporations, transnational corporations, have a cumulative control of like 70% of all these transnational corporations. So there's a really tiny group of corporations. And what that does is to create that massive disempowerment that Roger was talking about at the beginning.
Yeah.
And it's really that disempowerment that led to the election of Trump. I think some people would argue, and the putting down of the and not all that voted for Trump, I would say, felt disempowered, but feeling like they had been put down and not respected by the elite. It's interesting because it used to be the Democratic Party that would be looking at that seemed like it was for the people that were oppressed and put down, and now it seems like the tables have turned some, and yet who knows what. I think the parties have all changed. I was going to say something about the political party system too, Chris, in terms of this, because when I was hearing Roger, and the question that you originally asked was, would people trust this? Well, not if it looks like it currently does, because right now what it currently does is that it's people fighting to the death, not literally, but it feels like that, where they are not willing to compromise at all. And compromise doesn't get people reelected. And that's part of the problem with our political system right now in the US, is that they are running for election almost as soon as they get elected. So they have to speak to their base. And their base, oftentimes the person that's running against them in their base is more conservative or more liberal than they are, depending on which party that they're running with. And so they've got to go towards the extreme, not be moderate. And if they have shown that they've compromised at all with the other side, then they don't get reelected. If we had a lottery system or some more representative form of government that truly was representative, like we used to potentially had, and I would add, if the federal government people, the national legislator people would actually stay in Washington and their kids would go to school with the same people and be on the same ball teams and actually work across the aisle, that would also be, so that they would get to know each other as humans and as people, not just immediately as soon as they got into, elected, they are sent to their sides, their edges. And
I mean, one of the groups of people that we talk to are elected representatives, and a lot of people who are working in politics, they're very. Some of them are so frustrated. A lot of people enter politics with good intentions, but their hands are just tied by this kind of complicated party system, and I think of like politicians really as like the spores that sit on top of like a fungus, and the party is this big massive roots underneath, and really the politicians are just the fruit. Oh, look at me, vote for me. And so they don't really have any, even though they're actually the people in Senate and Congress or wherever just voting, they don't necessarily, know or understand what they're talking about. This comes, this idea of certainty and confidence again, and technical know-how. Like, there are some complex problems that just demand a lot of knowledge. And so, do you can
you can
deliberative
have citizen assemblies and bring in experts. I mean, most of them that are done in the UK, for example, and I'm not the expert on this, Roger is, but and one of the questions I wanted to know from him is, has he ever seen any of this working in the US? But so maybe he can come back to that in a minute. But they oftentimes will bring in people who have expertise in certain areas, and they will be gathering information from people before they deliberate. And so it's not like it's that they have to be the experts to be able to deliberate. They just have to learn.
So,
And it reminds me of something that, Richard Feynman said about not, we have to have our minds open to the unknown and learn. And that brings us back, full circle. I'm thinking about the time, and I'm thinking about our very patient audience here. I think at this point, we've had a really good grounding in like nonviolence and deliberative democracy. And so what I would like to do is just open up the conversation to everyone. So, Darryl, if you could just put us all into like one room. And if I'm going to ask people if they have questions, comments, concerns, or thoughts, just to raise their hand. And then once I can see everybody, I will just invite people to speak. So this is your chance to ask questions. I'm going to have to put it in gallery view. So does anyone have any comments or thoughts from the audience? I'll just give you a second to think that through. Everyone's afraid. Okay, Rosa asks in the chat, curious to hear more about this. What kind of, yeah. Short time after the panel. Inherent need for power is Halsey Taylor there. The inherent need, human need for power is being overlooked. I don't mind having these kind of little moments to give people time to think and digest. We've just had a huge amount of information thrown at us, thinking about a huge array of things. And there's so many things that we never touched on. For example, like ecosystems, and I think about the companies like, I don't know, the East India Company. I'm going back a few centuries here. I feel like there's some real changes that have to happen in our world in the next few years. And I'm wondering if deliberative democracy is going to be the tool that enables us to do that.
Well, I'll just, I know
Yeah.
April was asking a little bit about does it work in the United States, and it's an interesting question.
Yeah.
There's a lot of talk in the communities around deliberative democracy now of what's called a deliberative wave. And what they mean by that is that there is a seeming swell of interest in deliberative democracy and deliberative processes. And I think Braver Angels is part of that, not in the sense of, citizen assemblies, but people wanting to get together and talk and have these kind of conversations. A lot of the early work was done not in the United States. So in Europe, the country that's actually furthest along, Ireland made a big splash when they had some citizen assemblies around abortion and I forget what the other one was, but and had people come together in a very religious country and decide to make abortion legal, and also gay marriage. That was the other one. And so that led to a lot of interest in it. But Belgium, this little country on continental Europe, especially in the part of Belgium called Flanders, has become the leader in the world in citizen assemblies. And in fact, they've now made citizen assemblies part of their regional legislature on a permanent basis. And so it's become part of their constitutional structure of government to have a constant citizen assembly inside it. In Canada, our neighbor to the north, a group called Mass LBP has been running citizen assemblies all for the last 15 years, hundreds and hundreds of them. There are a number of groups in the United States that have been running citizen assemblies, Healthy Democracy and others. We now, the Arendt Center where I work, the Hannah Arendt Center, has created something called the Democracy Innovation Hub, and we've become one of the groups around the world. We're working with 20 or 30 organizations around the United States, and we're currently working on citizen assemblies in the state of Washington, in the city of New York. We're talking to Texas. We're talking up in the Hudson Valley where BARD is located. There is really a deliberative wave going on. There's a lot of interest in this around the country, and I think it comes from a number of areas, but it comes from a feeling of frustration, and people really want to have these conversations. And from my view, that it's really the only. I don't see any other way forward. This is
right.
I don't know how else we bring power and legitimacy back to our government. So
wonderful. Thanks, Roger. That's cool. Yeah, look, situational awareness there. Rosa, you've got your hand up. Would you like to? maybe introduce yourself. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Well, I just wanted to thank you all for having this fascinating conversation. I am particularly interested in the ways that nonviolent direct action and deliberative democracy intersect, because I really think that we need both. I just want to say I was really loved the webs that you offered, Lester, the webs of violence, the webs of nonviolence. Roger, I really love your notion of power as the opposite of violence, because I do think that, just from a biological place, like we know that most animals will only be violent when they feel cornered, right? And so I think there's a lot of richness to explore there. And I just want to say, April, I am a huge fan of Braver Angels. In fact, I've been trained as a Braver Angels moderator, and I've facilitated a Braver Angels event. And I think what Braver Angels is doing is just awesome. So I'm really glad that this conversation is happening. And yeah, so this is just really, really rich. And I guess the only thing I do want to say as a, slightly older person here, I just want to really speak up for the previous wave, right? For all the great work that America Speaks did, for all the great work that Ned Crosby and the citizen juries did, and the deliberative polling work and all that, because I know that citizens' assemblies have really captured the public imagination, and that's great. And there's a lot of work, Daniel Yankelovich. I mean, there's a lot of work that came before that folks are building on these days. So I just wanted to kind of honor our ancestors here a bit. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Rosa.
I really appreciate that, Rosa. I mean, yes, Ned Crosby, America Speaks, these groups were super important. And, really, to some degree, we're working in the wilderness to some degree. And they are the ancestors of a lot of this. It's interesting that this new movement emerged largely out of Europe and then has come back and is now intersecting with those groups. And one of the things the Democracy Innovation Hub has been doing is actually trying to bring those existing groups and the new European interested citizen assembly groups together. And that's been a lot of the work we've been doing over the last few years. So it's very important.
I would love for us to kind of address the question that I think Rosa was asking also. I saw it in the chat earlier, is what is the role of nonviolent action in light of deliberative democracy? And I don't know. I mean, we don't have to be the only people that speak here in terms of answering that question. But I just want to bring us back to that question. If anybody wants to.
Has anyone ever done that, been involved in a non-violent protest? If anyone in the audience has had that experience, I'd love to hear about it. Don't be shy.
How do you do it? I think here's the question that I have is, how do you do it and not demonize the other? I mean, that to me is the key, is if I can still stand up for my own beliefs, right? I can still say, this is what is important, and I'm going to advocate for this, and I'm going to do it in a way that still honors you and your right to be in the space where you are.
Right.
This was
so hard.
Gandhi, I think Gandhi, I've been studying Gandhi for years, and I sort of consider him my guru in all this. Part of his secret, I think, was he said you separate the doer from the deed. So he would maintain respect and try to work on building relationships with his adversaries. And I think that's the best kind of nonviolence. So it's not just, and it's also these different kinds of nonviolence. It's not just, going out into the street and shouting, but trying to build like the kinds of democratic institutions you folks are experimenting with. And I think sometimes, we have to have both. Gandhi's idea was you resist the existing system, but you also build the new one. Mm-hmm. And so he was experimenting with, for example, his ashrams that were also kind of the core of like the Indian freedom movement, also the movement in South Africa against Indian apartheid, putting the Indians in a separate system, second-class citizens. And so the ashrams were a kind of center for planning and mobilizing, strategizing nonviolent action, but they were also experiments in living across diverse community, across lines of division in the system.
Yeah,
and I think we have to have both. I'm real excited about these experiments that Roger was talking about, and April, and the sort of deliberative democracy, the citizen assemblies, and so on. And there have also been all kinds of experiments also with ancestors in other parts of the world, right? Because democracy didn't just start in Athens around the same time; it was starting in South Asia. And the Buddhist monasteries had assemblies. Citizens, they had assemblies as well, and so I think we can also be hopeful. We never thought that the Berlin Wall would fall or that apartheid would end in South Africa. We've just created these things, and they come and go.
yeah, that's fascinating. And I think we talked about corporations as well. Like in our modern world, we're so atomized with our cars, with our echo chambers, and the spaces where we can interact with people just aren't there. As churches are becoming sort of less and less common, people aren't meeting in these places. It's harder to see people, harder to connect. So perhaps there's something that we can simply do, not for profit, not to make money, something that's free, where we can actually just connect people. I had this thought, what about if you ran lotteries, just not to discuss some topic? It almost goes back to what Roger was talking about before, where you just get into a room and meet and talk. How can we do this? I think this is something that individuals can do. They can
Kathy
work on this.
Wilkerson has a comment in the chat.
Oh, brilliant.
Chris, that you
Thank
might
you.
want to read. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Yeah. What did she say? Let me find it. So it's hard to keep up. Used acting on violence and personal sacrifice to destabilize existing power structures, but did not focus on demonizing the racist leaders, but instead the system. Yes, exactly what we're talking about, isn't it? It's about thinking about how the structures that we've built they're not satisfying from a human point of view. They don't create this authentic relationships that that come forward. They're it's how yeah. I mean, I was thinking about when you're on the phone to someone in a corporation, and they're constrained. They've got a script and so on. And sometimes it's really easy to get angry at the person on the other end of the phone. But if you remember that they're a human being in an office talking, then it can really help. You can often hear it when you remember their name and you just say their name to them and talk to them. You can actually hear it in their voices sometimes, how they're like,
yeah,
oh, last I'm talking to a human being, from the customer's point of view.
Hey, Rosa has she has a story.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, this is something that I experienced when years and years ago, when a coworker of mine came and said, would you be willing to sign here that you are willing to lay down on the streets of our main town and get arrested because they're about to come and spray pesticides on the great fields because there's this little critter from Southern California that's migrating north, and et cetera. So she started telling me about all this, and I was like, well, I'm getting a little old to lay down on the streets and get arrested. And she's like, oh, it doesn't matter. You can sign up and do support for somebody else, like some other person with kids gets arrested and you can go pick up their kids from the after school program and like that. So I found out a little bit more about what this thing was that was going on. And it turned out that the organizers of this had actually already gone to the Department of Agriculture. This was in Sonoma County. And it was this little pest that was threatening the grape growing fields there. We make a lot of wines in Sonoma County. I haven't lived there in 20 years, but I still really identify with that part of the world. So anyway, they had gone there, knocked on their doors, expressed their concerns in a very polite way, and they had been told that, oh, you guys don't know anything about business. You guys are just, dirt worshiping tree huggers. Go away.
Right.
So that's when the dirt worshiping tree huggers had started organizing. They had made contact with the No Spray campaign, which is an organization that provides support for all kinds of people who want to organize locally, with regard to spraying campaigns, because sometimes people spray these toxic pesticides, like on school grounds, and the moms want to organize and say, hey, no, wait a second, let's find other alternatives. So they got some consultation and some help. This was the Occidental Arts and Ecology Center that was spearheading this effort. And they started signing up people to do this nonviolent civil disobedience in the streets of the main town. And they were also doing a press campaign, right? So they were sending information to the local newspaper, we have 50 people who have signed up for this campaign. Next week, we have 100 people who have signed up for this campaign. Next week, we have 150 people. And by the time that they got to 350 people who had decided that they were going to go lay down on the streets of Santa Rosa, and, not all of those people were actually going to go lay down, because I know personally I was just going to do support or whatever. But then the organizers got a call from the Department of Agriculture saying, well, we actually want you to come in here because we want to talk with you. And the Occidental Arts and Ecology Center folks were awesome. This was way before I knew about facilitation or any of this stuff. They said, yeah, we'll come and we'll bring with us a professional facilitator so that we can work out something that we all feel good about. And of course, it did not just take them one meeting. But the one meeting was good enough and respectful enough and inclusive of everybody's concerns that people were willing to meet again. And then they met again. And I think it took them like 9 or 10 meetings before they were able to work out something that really worked all around. So I love that story because it's an example to me of how, from the mediation perspective, what we're doing is we're changing the BATNA. BATNA is the term meaning best alternative to a negotiated action. And if the other side thinks that they can ignore you and no problem, then they're not going to come to the negotiating table. But if they, are going to have bad press, or if something's going to happen that's not in their interest, then they're often much more willing to negotiate. So that's my short story.
That's fantastic. And it resonates with a story I heard recently about a group involved in Brave Angels. I can't remember which town it was, on the West Coast somewhere, where a group of Reds and Blues got together to discuss a topic, went to their elected representative. Now, if you're an elected representative, normally people are coming in screaming at you, saying you've got to not do this or you've got to do this, but this was a group of people who got together, organized, both on both sides of the political spectrum, had a really good set of information, and put this proposal in front of this elected person. He's like, wow. And then when we go back to Roger's thought about power, that has power, that action, that sort of quality, that non-partisan nature of it, it has power over that politician. If he's looking at that and he's thinking, how am I going to get elected again if I ignore this? Because this is both the red and the blues working together. Oh my goodness, now I have to almost in a way that's where this concept of legitimacy arising from the quality of the process kind of comes from. That non or bipartisan conversation where people come together in a community, that has legitimacy, maybe even more than the elected person in that instance. And so, and I think this is just a really nice way to tie together all the different themes that we've been talking about this evening about, just networks of people listening to each other, connecting, building up common stories and relationships, and then that in itself generating BATNAs, generating the alternatives that many of the frustrated politicians are looking for. And then if we can kind of create that kind of that can then create this sense of empowerment that individuals have. They can go out and why can't you just run a lottery in your town? Why not? Go and get the electoral thing, email 50 people at random, get them in a room and say, what do you think about X, Y, Z? And people can just do this. They don't need permission. And that can generate this kind of movement of power. And I think this is something that Braver Angels is talking about. And what Braver Angels can do in that kind of context is it can upskill people to help you work in these really complicated, complex scenarios. So I can sort of, I'm trying to sum up this whole conversation in like 1 minute. So, you know, because I'm conscious of time and we're going to draw to a close in a minute, but it's been a really fascinating conversation. And I just want to give a chance to our speakers, just if they have one last thought that they'd like to share with us, you know, maybe something that you're going to take away from this meeting, this conversation, perhaps in any order. I don't mind if anyone wants to go. Any thoughts?
Well, I'll just pick up on Rosa's idea, and you mentioned, I forget what it was, the BATNA thing, the best, what is it, best
Alternative to negotiated action, something like that.
Okay.
Yeah.
You know, what it made me think of, and maybe this is a complete off the wall connection, but I co-taught a course with David Von Raybrook on citizen assemblies about 4 or 5 years ago. And we came in, and the first day we asked all the kids in the class, you know, on a 1 scale, 1 to 10, rate the healthcare system. And they all were like 1. And they said, all right, if you had a 10 healthcare system, what would it look like? And they all talked about, you know, eternal healthcare and, you know, and socialized medicine and everything. And then he said, all right, now imagine going from 1 to 3, you know, and not to where the 10 that you want to get to, but just incrementally up. And that was like one of the real light bulb moments in my head around this stuff, because it's about not how you get to what you think is the best, but how you find a common ground with people and you get a little bit higher, a little bit better, right? And our politics is so much, we want to get to the best. We want to get to what we think is just. You know, and one of the things I have to constantly tell my students is politics is not about achieving justice. Justice isn't, you know, it's a thing it's always in the future. Politics is about it getting a little bit better than it is now. It's incremental. It's about compromise. It's about finding what we share. Right. And I just come back to that view that, to me, what deliberation allows is us to focus not on just what differentiates us, although we should be aware of that and we should talk about it and we should learn to be okay with that. But it really to focus on, okay, what do we share and what is common and how can we get a little bit closer to where we want to be? So, you know, the alternatives don't have to be the best. They can be a little better. And that's, to me, an important part of our politics and idea of deliberation.
Thanks, Roger. That's a wonderful thought. Lester or April, you're welcome to say anything or not.
Yeah, you know, many years ago, I was at a meeting in South India and got invited to join a protest march in Delhi on my way home. And there was a group of landless peasants who were walking for 40 days from the traditional birthplace of Krishna to Delhi, demanding to meet with the minister who was in charge of land policy. And so I joined them. I didn't walk the 40 days. I walked the last 2 kilometers of their march, and I was so amazed at the spirit of these people. And we had a language barrier. I had somebody help me do some translation, but you know, the spirit of their resilience and their energy. And these were landless peasants, right? These were not college professors, you know, or geniuses.
Right.
But I had this idea, which I've never followed through on, and this conversation makes me want to reiterate it, that we should have a conference where we bring together all the scholars on some topic, and instead of having them give papers, they just listen for 3 days.
I love that.
We bring in people who really know what people are thinking about and what's really happening in the world of all these people we never come into contact with in a daily life. Yeah. And so we listen for 3 days and then we go home and write our papers.
Yeah. I love that idea. I love that idea.
We really need to think, you know, very differently. You know,
yeah.
my wife's been talking the last couple of days with these women in the Congo who are mining cobalt, and they're heart-wrenching stories. I mean, you could hardly stand to have her tell them to me secondhand.
Yeah.
And we don't really know how
And
most
we
of the
don't-
people in the
yeah.
world,
We don't make that connection with the things in our daily lives, like mobile phones and so on. We don't make those, and we have to hear those stories. April, would you like to say anything? Just you don't
Yeah,
have to.
so no, I want to bring it back to the whole issue of conversational receptiveness and conflict resilience that I mentioned at the beginning. This has to happen within ourselves first. Then it can happen within our tribes and within our groups. But we have to depolarize within before we can actually even go towards this, whether it would be, in a deliberative democracy way or in a nonviolent protest. I read a book recently, older book now, but by Arbinger Institute, The Anatomy of Peace. I'm putting a quote from that book into the chat, and I'll just read it because I think it's so powerful. If we're going to find lasting solutions to difficult conflicts or external wars that we find ourselves in, we first need to find our way out of the internal wars that are poisoning our thoughts, feelings, and attitudes towards others. If we can't put an end to the violence within us, there's no hope for putting an end to the violence without. So it's really like that ending.
That's fantastic. That's a beautiful quote to end this conversation on. And I just want to say thank you to everyone who's been part of this, and to do join our mailing list and come to the other conversations. And I hope to build a nice community of people who are thoughtful and trying to work towards a better world. Thank you so much for your time. And with that, and yeah, big thank you to our speakers. But we'll leave it there for now. Thank you so much.